So, good evening. Welcome everyone to yet another program organized by Chennai International Center. We are very happy to have you all here. Let us begin the session with a welcome address by Mr. Anand Raghavan. He is the trustee and a director of Chennai International Center. Anand, let me welcome you to invite the panelists and begin the session, please.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And on behalf of the Board of Directors of the Chennai International Center, I extend a warm welcome to all of you to yet another virtual event. The title is very interesting. It is called India and China, How Do Security and Trade Impact Bilateral Relations? In fact, just before we started, we were having a discussion that this is the 126th event of CIC since it started in 2016. The last 2 years' journey has been mostly on the virtual format, thanks to the situation which has been there around us. In fact, today, while the corona numbers are coming down, the water level in the reservoirs are going up. So because of the floods, we are still not able to manage the physical format, but I'm sure in due course, we will be back to brick and mortar type of physical events. The subject contextually is so important today that we thought that we have to discuss it threadbare. And in what better format than these three extremely erudite speakers with a moderator whom I'll be introducing as we go along. Now, India-China has always had a very checkered relationship and history. And very consciously, the organizers felt that security precedes trade and commerce. There have been 5 treaties between these countries since 1965. There have been several clashes along the border also. Latest, of course, was the 15 June clash. A $14 trillion economy like China cannot ignore a $3 trillion economy like India and vice versa. Trade between these two countries are now $100 billion in October. And the trade gap, of course, is coming down to $47 billion in the last count. So security is important. Trade is also important. So we have to dissect this particular subject. Very eminent people. Mr. Vijay Gokhale, former Foreign Secretary. I don't wish to introduce him. Everybody knows him. I'll just leave it at that. We have Mr. Ajay Shankar, a very distinguished fellow at TERI and also former Secretary of DIPB. We have Indrani Bagchi, a very acclaimed reporter in the Times of India. She has been writing extensively on Indo-China matters. The moderator for today's session is Anand Krishnan, who is based in Hong Kong, again covering extensively on India-China matters. He works for Hindu. So this is going to be a feast, and I request all of you to fasten your seat belts and enjoy this session. We have planned it for about 60 minutes, followed by Q&A. I will now hand over the proceedings to Anand Krishnan, the moderator, who will take over this session. Anand Krishnan, please.
Thank you so much for the introduction, and thank you all for joining us today. And thanks especially to everyone back home in Chennai who has been joining us. I think it's been a challenging few days, and I hope this finds everybody well and safe. So as Anand said, today we are looking at the current state of play in India-China relations and the road ahead. As most of you probably know, we are still in the midst of this 18-month-long crisis on the line of actual control, which shows no signs of being resolved soon. But this conversation will try and focus on the bigger picture and ask what this very changed security situation, this very changed security dynamic means for the broader relationship. As Anand also mentioned, just in the past few days, we had new trade numbers come out showing that in the midst of all of these problems, bilateral trade for the first time has crossed $100 billion in a calendar year, and we still have 2 months to go. We will ask, is this trade relationship sustainable? Is it healthy for India? What are India's options in dealing with this? So these are some of the things we'll be looking at. And as Anand said, I think we really couldn't have asked for a better panel. Before we come to India and China, I thought maybe perhaps we'll begin very quickly by first looking at recent developments in China this week, where you had this big party plenum that you may have read about that concluded on Thursday. And I just thought that we should take advantage of the fact that we have with us Ambassador Vijay Gokhale, who I think is one of the sharpest observers in India on all the internal happenings in China that all of us are scratching our heads about most of the time. So if I can come to you first to get this kickstarted, Ambassador Gokhale, what should we in India make of what's been happening in Beijing, especially this week, as well as going into next year when you're having this big leadership congress coming out, in terms of Xi Jinping's position, and more broadly in terms of this very muscular sort of nationalist rhetoric that we keep hearing coming out of Beijing? How should we in India look at these internal developments and what it may mean for us, if we can get started with that?
Yeah, thank you, Anand. And it's really a privilege to be on the same panel with Indrani and Dr. Ajay Shankar. So thank you for having us. Anand, to my understanding, this plenary meeting has cemented the fact that Xi Jinping is not only China's dominant leader, but in all probability will continue after the next party congress in 2022. Not that this came as a great surprise, because ever since 2018, when the constitution of China was changed to allow the president of the People's Republic of China to have more than 2 terms, and ever since the party declared in 2017 that Xi Jinping was the core of the 5th generation of leadership, signs were already quite clear about the possibility of Xi Jinping continuing in office. But what I think is significant about this plenum is that a resolution has been passed which deals with the history of the People's Republic of China and the Communist Party over the past 100 years. And more particularly, is the first resolution to deal with the party after 1981. Up to in 1981, the last such resolution was passed on the history of the Communist Party and its achievements. That was when Deng Xiaoping was the leader. So in a sense, this is supposed to be the definitive history of the Communist Party and China from 1981 until 2021. And the core or key point in this is that China is now entering a new period in its existence as a country, and the Communist Party is entering the 3rd phase of its leadership. And that phase is one in which China will be strong, China will stand up and take its rightful place in the world, and the Communist Party is the institution that is historically invested with this task. And Xi Jinping, as the core of that Communist Party, is the great helmsman or leader who will steer the course. So in a sense, I would think that the significance of the recent plenary meeting of the Central Committee has given the final political stamp of approval, not only on Xi Jinping's continuing in office, but on now recognizing him even officially as the leader of China. Now, what impact this has globally is not yet clear. Indeed, the resolution itself has not become public yet, as far as I understand, and so we don't even know what the specific contents are. But what it does mean is that the Chinese leader has been given a freer hand to deal with international relations, and therefore one should anticipate some sort of an impact or influence on our relationship, and by our I mean India-China relations as well.
Indrani, if I could put that to you as well, you've been reporting the ins and outs of the India-China relationship. You, like me, we were covering the summit in Wuhan, and then Xi Jinping coming to Mamallapuram, and then just 6 months after that, you had this complete turnaround.
Breakdown.
Complete breakdown, and it's pretty much swung 180 degrees. And I think that it seems that people in Delhi are still, we've had different officials at various levels use the same phrase that there isn't a credible explanation yet for what exactly happened on the LAC. So putting that in perspective, and putting in perspective the fact that you're seeing China's actions on the LAC, China's actions vis-a-vis Taiwan, how do you think Delhi would be looking at this? The fact that Xi Jinping is going to this next Congress next year in this position of strength, that he's going to be here to stay. To put it very simply, is that something worrying as far as India is concerned, in your view?
Well, Xi Jinping staying is less of a worry. I mean, in the sense that Xi Jinping is now a devil we know. He has been around for almost 2 terms now. It's for a decade, and what he is doing is actually of greater concern. Certainly, as you mentioned, not just on the LAC, but on Taiwan and South China Sea, those are areas of concern. I mean, just 2 weeks ago, they cleared the boundary law, which is actually, I would say, would have grave implications for the India-China larger relationship, but certainly on the boundary negotiations in the future. I interviewed the former Foreign Secretary Shamsaran on the subject, which is available for anybody. But it is going to make things very difficult, I think, on the boundary negotiations. On Taiwan, and it's interesting you mentioned that, and I'm just taking sort of forward what Mr. Gokhale just said, because frankly, there's nobody better than Mr. Gokhale to explain what happened. But and when you talked about the great helmsman, I mean, if Deng Xiaoping had integrated, so to speak, Hong Kong and Macau, there is only Taiwan left, and is one of the things that Xi Jinping wants to do is that last unfinished work of the integration of Taiwan. Is that going to be on his agenda? And if that is, what are the implications for the India-China relationship and for of course the larger security relationship, security situation in that region? So I think those are areas of growing concern.
Right. And it is strange, Mr. Shankar, that I know you've been following quite a bit on how the politics of this relationship impinges on the economy front, on the trade front. And as was mentioned at the start of this program, Anand mentioned that you reached this milestone in the strangest time, in this year where the relationship has sort of plunged to its lowest depths. You've reached this milestone that they've been talking about for years of $100 billion in trade. So what have you made of the fact that we're now in this curious position where trade, at least numbers-wise, seems to be booming, but politically, strategically, we are at a very, very low point, Mr. Shankar?
My take on the trade issue is somewhat different, and which is that the trade relationship with China has had the effect of hampering our growth in industry, our growth in manufacturing, our GDP growth. Some people privately say that it has had the effect of contributing to somewhat de-industrializing India. Now, that has been a trend that has been going on for quite some time. So if you look at trade numbers, 2001-2, we were barely 3 billion. Now they are our largest trading partner, or almost there. And the trade has a huge trade deficit, which has come down a little bit in the last couple of years. But in substance, it is similar to the trade of, if I were to put it more dramatically, the East India Company with what was India in the early 19th century. And what we saw was the next 100 years of deindustrialization. And I would like to draw attention to what Biden said in his address to the Congress this year. He said we are in competition with China and we will to win this century. And then he went on to say that there is no reason why American workers in Pittsburgh should not be able to make the wind turbines or the solar panels, etc., etc. And then he went on to draw attention to a 1930s law, which allows the US to ensure that US taxpayers' money is used only for buying products made in America. This law had been forgotten in the last many years, but it remained on the statute book. Now, my view is that we as a country seem to be accepting the fact that China has caught up with America, may overtake America, and that it is beyond us to try and catch up with China. Now, we seem to forget that in 91, our per capita incomes were at par. Technologically, some of us felt we were ahead. In many areas, they were ahead. So in 30 years, they're 5 times ahead of us. So we have to take an internal strategic view that do we want to catch up or not? The rest, I think, would follow. And catching up is something which would require a certain kind of will, which we don't seem to be displaying. So to just give 2 examples, last year, the Chinese were unhappy with Australia because they called for an independent inquiry into the origin of the Wuhan virus. The Chinese said no more coal imports. I think 70% coal imports of China came from Australia. They've had a lot of difficulty in the last few weeks, power cuts, well publicized, but as I can see, there is no sign of relenting on the part of the Chinese leadership vis-a-vis the Australians on this. And 2 other examples I would give. One is when I was young, this is early 60s. The Chinese were reasonably poor, and they took on the 2 superpowers, the Soviet Union as well as the US, and see where they are today. And 100 years back, when we had been colonized, we burnt English clothes because we believed that we would get somewhere. So I think the country needs to take a view on whether we want to catch up with China and do all that it takes, or we are happy to be a kind of second-rate middling economic power in the next 2 decades. Thank you.
Ambassador Gokhale, so it's an interesting comment to respond to. If I don't know if you would accept that India sees itself as a secondary power to China, you would probably have a different view, I would imagine. But the question I wanted to...
But on that, I want to make one more comment, which is that if you look at the Soviet Union and the West, 70s and early 80s, there was strategic parity of a substantial kind. But the Soviet Union hollowed out in terms of the economic capacity to compete with the West. So it could well be argued that somewhat similar things are happening in our economic side vis-a-vis China.
So, Ambassador Gokhale, one of the founding sort of premises that India had when we normalized relations with China was that you would try and shelve differences for a while and work on other areas. And that's probably one reason why trade boomed so much. So looking back on those last 3 decades, would you say that that model that both sides came to in 1988 worked fairly well, at least in keeping the peace for as long as it did? And going forward, do you think it's I mean, the argument now from Delhi is it's untenable to continue having these parallel tracks in the relationship. So could you share your thoughts on that? Are those days gone, and why is it now difficult to continue with having these parallel tracks that we've had for so many years now?
Yeah. Well, Anand, the answer to this is that there can be no doubt that the modus vivendi that Prime Minister Rajiv Gandhi reached with Deng Xiaoping brought 25 years of relative peace and tranquility to us. We tend to forget that the circumstances at that time made this policy something which was not just suitable, but also necessary. The West had significantly normalized relations with China by 1990, notwithstanding the blip as a result of the Tiananmen incident and Western sanctions. We know that that blip lasted for less than 24 months before the West began to sort of continue their love affair with China. We know that towards the end of the Soviet Union, they were moving towards normalization, and that if the Tiananmen incident had not happened, there would have been a full normalization of Sino-Soviet relations. We were also aware that we were in economic difficulties in the period 1988 to 1992. I don't think that the government of India had very many choices when it came to China. It certainly did not suit anybody's interests in India to have a high tension relation of animosity with the Chinese. So I believe that the Rajiv Gandhi Deng Xiaoping modus vivendi was not only something which was a desirable objective, but was from our perspective also dictated by necessity. Now, what has changed, of course, is that China has appended the modus vivendi. The modus vivendi was predicated on two important assumptions relating to the India-China boundary. First, that we would try and settle the matter peacefully through negotiations and without the use of force. And secondly, that in the interim, we would keep peace and tranquility on the line of actual control, including inter alia, by clarifying the line of actual control. What happened after 2013, and more particularly in 2020, was that the Chinese side has reneged on both these understandings. In other words, the Chinese side has brought the boundary question or the border issue front and center of the relationship. And therefore, there does not seem to be any sense, to my mind, for the government of India to continue to hold on to the modus vivendi. And therefore, correctly, in my opinion, the government's position has shifted to say that we now need to deal with all issues together and that we cannot separate the boundary question from the rest of the relationship. So it is in this sense, and for this, I hold the Chinese responsible.
Staying on the same point, Ambassador Gokhale, which I think is a really important point that you mentioned on the boundary being front and center. Indrani mentioned this border law as well, which I think reinforces what you just said. So for India, what would this mean, Ambassador Gokhale, staying on the LAC for a moment, given that these agreements seem to have broken down? It's been 18 months now where you've had a huge number of forward deployments by both sides. Do you think that while both sides are still negotiating this at various levels, looking at the pattern of how things have unfolded so far, in your personal view, do you think there's no going back to managing the boundary as we did for these past few decades? And if so, what would be the consequences for India of having a so-called live LAC, which is going to require much more investment, infrastructure, keeping troops for months on end? What would be those consequences for India to deal with?
Yeah, that's a very thought-provoking question, Anand. I think there is no option for either side but to go back to managing the boundary. Because I don't see, unless by some miracle there is a political will on both sides to settle the boundary question, any immediate solution to that issue. And if that is the case and we are going to live with the disputed boundary, then it is incumbent on both sides to manage that. However, I think at this stage, the government of India is not looking necessarily at how we manage the boundary, but at making clear to the Chinese side that the circumstances have been altered by them and that India will take corresponding steps under those circumstances to ensure that there is no encroachment along the line of actual control. So in my book, The Long Game, I made a very specific point that when Chinese speak, their words do not convey emotion, they convey messages. And I believe that this time, the government of India's words as well are not necessarily conveying emotion, but messages. To my mind, that message is quite clear. The message is really in three parts. First, the point I elaborated, which is the boundary question will no longer be put aside or put in a place the Chinese want to put it in while we get on with the rest of the relationship. The second message is that if the Chinese side wishes to escalate matters, the government of India is prepared to pay the political, financial, and military costs of taking countermeasures on the Indian side. And the third point is that we are prepared to negotiate along the line of actual control. In other words, we do not expect to be on our side to initiate conflict. And in that regard, we are prepared to go halfway to meeting them in trying to arrive at a new modus vivendi. I think these messages are important, and we need to take the government of India's position for what it is, a message to the Chinese side. The question of whether or not we will manage the situation will come subsequently, depending on the Chinese response to that message.
Indrani, on the topic of messaging from the Indian government, one thing that you've been reporting for the last few months as well is that one consistent message is that it can't be business as usual with China. That's a phrase we've heard quite a bit of. Do you think that India has conveyed that in terms of actual measures it has taken credibly enough? And if it has, why, in your view, why does it appear to be that, as far as we can tell, it doesn't seem to have reached the Chinese, at least in terms of their willingness to seek an end to this crisis?
So great question, actually. Now, my view would be that the message has been, and from everything that I have heard, that the message has been repeated at every forum or at every level, so that there is no ambiguity. And I think Vijay has got it absolutely pat, the message. I mean, I wouldn't have, I mean, he's obviously the best person to say that. But that message, I think, has gone through. I don't think the Chinese haven't heard it. I don't think they want to do anything about it right now. In the sense that the difficulties in the trade relationship are manifest. We can see that. We can see the fact that the Chinese are, putting up more non-tariff barriers, let's say on the marine products. I mean, there is no scientific evidence that COVID viruses survive on plastic covering of prawns, but that's a problem for them. The fact that they haven't taken we've got 23,000 odd students, Indian students studying in China. They haven't taken them back. They haven't allowed them to return. The fact that travel has not resumed. The fact that there is a very open price gouging on exports to India. And here, I mean, I'm no trade expert, but from my conversations with people, a lot of the figure that you see today is it's a pent-up demand that has over the last year and a half, but also what they call a higher price realization, in the sense that the same thing just costs much more. And I think we saw a lot of that during the bad days. For instance, during the second wave, when Indians buying ventilators or oxygen concentrators from China found contracts being cancelled, prices being doubled completely arbitrarily. So I think there is the figure that you're seeing today may have some of these elements, and I'm not so sure. But the fact that there is a distance, an economic distance is being built up on the Indian side is quite clear, and we can see that mainly in the tech sector. So maybe some of the government projects might come back, but we do see some of the sectors that are actually been told to and are now moving elsewhere to look for financing. So it's not merely in the trade of goods. There's a deeper economic relationship is being sort of strained.
No, that is a great point, and we will come to that. I want to press you all on the fact that there is a bit of a decoupling going on in terms of tech and investment in the last few years. It's there to see. But before we get to that, Mr. Shankar, on the boundary situation, it's clear that India is doing everything it can militarily to send a message to China. There's no doubt about that India is matching China and its deployments all along the LAC, and has prevented further ingress so far. What do you think India should do, and is there scope going beyond military measures? If you look at the trade front, the economy front, the fact of India's market, which I know that you've argued previously, should be used more strategically. What, in your view, are the options India has going beyond military measures to deal with the current situation as it is?
India must first make up its mind that it is prepared to pay a higher price, a higher cost to stand up. Because the fact of the matter is trade has gone up. So obviously the Indian market players are not prepared to pay a higher price. Now, whatever we buy from China can be imported from somewhere else or the other. They're not the monopoly suppliers of anything in the world, or practically nothing. But that willingness to pay a higher price is a precondition. And it is for the long haul. It's not something you do in a year or two. And on this, I would quote what a leading industrialist said in a CII public event. This is about 13-14. That you stopped import of gold because you had economic issues. But when gold comes into India, it either stays in somebody's locker or some jeweler gets some money, some jobs to make ornaments out of it. But our policy over the last 15 years has been of encouraging Chinese imports, consciously or unconsciously, at the cost of Indian manufacturing. So in the same event, he said, when a Chinese power plant comes in on a zero duty regime, then an Indian factory doesn't give jobs to people who make the thermal power plant. So if you look at the last decade, roughly 50,000 megawatts of conventional thermal power equipment has come to India from China. And it has led to the closure of two private investments having to write off their investments of making thermal power plants because of the absence of a level playing field. That's a long discussion. Similarly, if you look at our largest solar program, the large solar program is entirely Chinese imports. And when the case was made for imposing duties on these, the government felt, no, we shouldn't do it. Now, whether the government felt that strategically it was important to increase Chinese engagement in the economy, so it would lead to better strategic behavior, I don't know. But it's obviously not done it, and it has not worked even in Japan, who's contributed to China's rise. So we should be prepared to say that for the long haul, we can live without you, and we pay the price for it. And that we should also recognize that the Chinese economy is so large that today whatever we import from them is not large enough to make a real difference to them. But if we stay the course, sooner or later, they would see reason. And even if they don't, we should be willing to go along ekla chalo re. The Chinese did it in the 60s. So why should we believe that our dependence is so large that we cannot use it? And I'll give just two more examples from those from whom the Chinese have learned. So Japan, in its great days of rise, was a US strategic partner, and therefore the US was kind to it. But US business was hopping mad that the Japanese would neither allow FDI nor sale of American cars, etc. And when I first went to Korea, Japan was at its height in the late 80s. And on the roads, you didn't see Toyotas. In the shops, you didn't see Canon and Sony. Then I asked, do you have it? He plotted out. So the Korean consensus was that we have to catch up with the Japanese. Now, we don't seem to have that kind of ambition, and I think it's high time we got it, or accept being a second-rate power.
Just to press you on that, Mr. Shankar, is it, as you say, only a question of, you suggested that it could have been policy of the government of India to have greater trade with China. The other sort of possibility is, obviously, it's the companies who are importing the cheaper power equipment, the companies who are importing the cheaper telecom equipment. Is it they who are not playing ball? And if so, what is, shouldn't the onus be on policy at the government level to fashion a different kind of relationship?
Whatever the motivations were there, we need not go into it now because it's history. But clearly, we need to take a call that whether we will stand up, and in case we'll be prepared to pay a higher price, and we will use all measures which are feasible and pragmatic. So we need not be doctrinaire. So we need to be very pragmatic and feasible, and this is what the Chinese keep doing. I mentioned the example of they're saying no coal imports from Australia for one announcement. And here we have still not been able to take any hard decisions and convey a clear message that till these things happen, we will not budge no matter what the cost and no matter what the time. And part of the problem is within India itself, that within India, the consumer seems to have greater political weight than the producer and the one who creates jobs. So it's a part of that problem which India has to actually come to terms with, because we are entering into a structural crisis on the job front.
If I could pose a similar question to you, Ambassador Gokhale, in terms of dealing with China from a whole of government perspective, rather than, say, looking at what we do militarily, looking at what we do economically, from your own time in policy making, do you think we have come to that stage where we are assessing the relationship, cohesively, in a coherent way, in terms of, say, trade policy or economic policy, fashioning a larger strategic objective? And do you see that playing out, for instance, now where India has taken measures, whether it's stricter curbs on FDI, or most recently, whether it's curbing visas for Chinese, or not allowing them to get e-visas? Do you think we are moving to that, or not quite there yet, Ambassador Gokhale?
Anand, I think that for some time now, there has been a whole of government approach to China. But so in other words, even maybe 10 to 15 years ago, I do not believe that China policy was made solely in the Ministry of External Affairs, or for that matter of fact, in the government of India. There have always been other players, and those include the military, they include business as well, they also include the media, and of course, also included in this group are the political parties. But I do share Dr. Ajay Shankar's point that we may not have so far made up our mind in a determined fashion to de-link ourselves. And by that, I don't mean to completely dehyphenate, but I mean to de-link ourselves from the Chinese import addiction. I think the recent figures only go to prove one point, which is that some of our key economic sectors, automotives, electronics, pharmaceuticals, are heavily, telecommunications are heavily dependent on Chinese intermediate imports, parts, spares, and capital goods. I think, as Dr. Ajay Shankar correctly said, in a large measure, there would be alternative suppliers. Perhaps not the cheapest, but on the other hand, certainly the alternatives are available, and what is required are hard decisions to divert the imports, either from China to those countries, or to do import substitution, which is, if you have the core capability to manufacture them, to do so. I think that is where the direction in which we ought to be going. Obviously, I'm not privy to the government's thinking in the matter. Perhaps they are already thinking along those lines. But I don't believe that in earlier times, we actually took that final step to diversify our imports to the point where we reduced our dependency on China.
Indrani, would you share that view in terms of this idea of decoupling from China? A, is it feasible? And B, should it be a selective approach where, say, India focuses on specific sectors where there may be vulnerabilities? And from your reporting on this, is that the conversation that's happening in Delhi right now, which is that wanting to move with some sense of urgency? I mean, people have been talking about for years and years about the numbers of API imports, the numbers of, whether the percentage of power equipment that comes into India. But do you actually see that, for instance, with the 5G decision, for example? Is that something that happened just because of the current situation we're facing on the borders? Or for you, does that signal something bigger than that in terms of where we see that relationship going?
So I sort of break this into two, Anant, and one is, this whole idea that we don't have the sort of national strength to do this. Honestly, government of India is the biggest culprit. if you have a government procurement policy that says that the cheapest must be taken, or what they call L1, and nobody has seen it, it is kind of rich for government to say we must adopt a national approach. Nobody has changed that policy in government. They're still looking for the cheapest. If you are looking for the cheapest API, let us say, where is your paracetamol API coming from? You shut down your the Hardwar, whatever, wherever it was, pharmaceutical factory, and you got it from China because it was cheap. And basically, India has fed into the Chinese narrative, and so to roll that back, I don't see anybody. And you're looking at it today, post Galwan, post Eastern Ladakh, and reviewing why we are so dependent, or post COVID, and reviewing why we are so dependent on the Chinese. I mean, why did we get there in the first place? We got there in the first place because you were looking for cheap power equipment. You were looking for cheap APIs. You were not looking for value. You were not looking to create value. And that is the government. That was where the government started. That percolated everywhere. So that's one. If today you might be setting up pharmaceutical parks in the country to enable API production or API other intermediates, etc. But honestly, it's a long road that we have to travel back. And so I would say the second part of your question, I think, is important, which is that on 5G, I think they took a decision not merely because of Ladakh and not merely because of the difficulties between us, but I think it was also because of what that Huawei entailed. I mean, they were okay till Ladakh to go along with Huawei being one of the players, even though there have been reports about the civil military fusion, which is the reason why we should have stopped Huawei in its tracks a long time ago. But we didn't. And it took something like this or it also took a lot of American pressure, let me tell you, or Western pressure to be able to say that, you do Huawei and you get cut off from a whole lot of other stuff. And a second part is the tech sector, as we spoke about earlier. The fintech and the other tech financing that used to come from China, it has now, because of the policies that were tweaked last year, now are not, and you're getting financing from other areas. So I think Ajay Shankar's point is perfectly valid, that you have to take that hard decision of being able that, yes, I will cut that addiction to cheap money, cheap stuff, and you will find opportunities, which we can see in the tech sector. Anand?
Dr. Shankar, would you agree with what Indrani said in terms of the fact that, as she said, to a large degree, it's the fact, the system, it's the policy that's kind of encouraged or driven us into this, as you said, East India Company type relationship with China? Is that why it happened? And if so, what would you say are things that should be done with a sense of urgency, policy-wise, to course correct? On the one hand, you said, it's consumer behavior, which may be fine, but in terms of government action, policy to shape that, what is it that should happen?
Once the nation makes up its mind, then it is very easy to do things very rapidly, which is not easily appreciated. So I'll go back in time a little to give one example. When the apartheid regime in South Africa was subject to sanctions by the OPEC countries, they went to a very expensive technology which the Germans had used in World War II to make oil out of coal. And they did it. And it continues to sell in South Africa because they've made all the breakthrough and therefore it's commercially viable. So if government were to decide that we will do all that it takes, so like APIs, if private sector is not willing to invest, you can make a public sector investment. It's really peanuts in terms of Government of India's budget to create a factory. But the mindset has to change that we have to do it and we'll do all that it takes. Then there are a range of instruments. Government procurement is one, tariff barriers, non-tariff barriers, liberal financing for private sector growth, or in the rare cases where it is completely unavoidable, in public sector. And further, there's no reason why government of India cannot put in 10,000-20,000 crores or whatever it costs to build a state-of-the-art chip manufacturing plant in India. You take a decision today, the plant will be functioning in 2-3 years. Because the lead time for industrial investment to mature into production has crashed globally. And to give the Chinese example, the Germans were leaders in solar panels till 2008-9. The Chinese were nowhere. We had actually a solar panel manufacturing plant in the public sector in the 80s. The Chinese took a deep breath and said, we'll get to the front, and they got to the front. The German industry is gone. So it's possible to do these things, but the current mindset has to change drastically. And what has to be really driving everybody is some sense of economic nationalism, more than harking on ancient glories or other things.
All right. So if you have questions, especially on the trade front, please use the raise hand option or type it into the Q&A box, and we'll come to you. But before we get to the Q&A, one round of questions that I wanted to end this discussion with. We've spoken on trade, we've spoken on security, is to look a little bit at the neighborhood, given that that's one area where there is going to be a lot of, where the China factor is something that looms large as far as India is concerned, both in South Asia and especially now in Afghanistan as well. If I can come to you on this, Ambassador Oakley, we recently had, India had this meeting of NSAs that we hosted. The Pakistanis publicly said they wouldn't attend. The Chinese came up with scheduling reasons to not attend. So from your perspective, looking at Afghanistan as an example, it seemed that, say, 5-10 years ago, we were speaking of possible India-China cooperation in the neighborhood or in third-party countries. Do you think now that landscape has somewhat changed dramatically?
Anant, there is no doubt that China now plays a much bigger role in South Asia than it did, say, 15 or 20 years ago. But to all those who wring their hands in India and say that we have lost our backyard, may I just say that globalization has ensured that nobody has a backyard. For 200 years, the United States, under the Monroe Doctrine, believed that both Americas belonged to its sphere of influence. But if you look from Cuba to Venezuela to Bolivia and elsewhere, the Russians and the Chinese are there. For 300 years, Eastern Europe and Central Asia was the backyard of the Russian Empire and the Soviet Union. Today, the European Union and NATO are knocking around in Eastern Europe on the borders of Russia. And the Chinese are rapidly making it uncomfortable for the Russians to be the hegemon in Central Asia. And even in the South Pacific, where those tiny islands, Kiribati, Vanuatu, Tuvalu, were all supposed to be part of the Australian sphere of influence, the Chinese are all over the place. My point is simple. There is no more an exclusive backyard in an age of globalization. There are only shared spaces. And our objective cannot be to recover a backyard, but to ensure that our strategic interests are taken care of in those shared spaces. Now, having made that point, nevertheless, I do believe that China's sort of influence is going to expand. And the simple reason for that is, as China's mindset changes from a regional to a global mindset, in other words, as China looks to be replacing the United States as the global hegemon, it sees its security perimeter no longer confined to its territorial boundaries. Its security perimeter is now transboundary. And that means South Asia is part of its security perimeter, and it sees its own role in South Asia and its influence as a legitimate part of its strategy for global power. We have to be prepared for it. We, I believe, are prepared for it. I think the government is well aware that we are dealing with a situation we have never faced in 70 years, a superpower on our doorstep. Now, the question is as to what policies we can enact in order to ensure two things. One, that a large part of the South Asian neighborhood and the Indian Ocean neighborhood takes care of our critical interests and does not cross our red lines with respect to China. And secondly, that we leverage other major powers or other major players in such a manner that we remain in the lead in South Asia, but we take their help in ensuring that we can provide alternatives to China in the development of our South Asian neighbors. And therefore, I believe there are sufficient policy alternatives, viable policy alternatives to deal with this issue.
Ambassador Gokhale, just to follow up on the question of providing alternatives, obviously there's been so much written and said about the Belt and Road Initiative and its presence in Nepal, Sri Lanka, in the neighborhood. Do you think it would be a mistake for India to try and do its own version of the BRI, or do you think that India would be better served not trying to match rupee for renminbi, which maybe would be a losing proposition, but to come up with something different, which is in line with its own values and being a different sort of player from China?
Anant, I want to make two comments about the BRI because I think this initiative has been inflated beyond its level of importance. It has been lionized for no reason. Let's look at the post-COVID situation. Across the board, from Latin America and Africa to Nepal and Myanmar, the amount of lending that China has done has fallen very significantly. From a peak of, say, $60 billion in 2017 to less than $5 billion in 2020. And that trend is continued through 2021, not because China cannot lend, but because it is aware that the borrower cannot pay. And ultimately, if we call England a nation of shopkeepers, I think the Chinese would be mighty incensed. They are the original nation of shopkeepers. They know the red and the black very clearly. First, number one. Number two, we have to be very clear in understanding the difference between a promise made on BRI and the actual delivery. If you look at Nepal alone, there is a raft of 20 projects, from the railways coming all the way to Kathmandu to multiple border openings which will give access to China. Almost none of these have actually materialized. In fact, post-COVID, the Chinese have shut the border trading posts and after 18 months have not opened it, even though the Nepalese want to reduce dependence on India. So the first point is, I don't think BRI will continue in the form that it did in 2013 and 14. Let us watch to see what happens. Secondly, I think it will be a cardinal mistake if we try to match it. This is precisely the sort of tactics and strategy China prefers, that is to financially exhaust us. And I don't believe the government of India intends to fall for that ruse. I think at this stage, the government's attention, to my mind, and again, I speak entirely as a private citizen, is to ensure that our delivery of projects that we have promised are delivered on time, and that new projects are those where both the borrower and the lender have stakes. I think we have a lot to work on in this area, but there have been significant improvements over the past few years, and there is no reason to believe that this will not over time be perfected. So I am not pessimistic about our development objectives in the neighborhood. And I think on BRI, we need to take a step back and to see what the post-COVID impact is going to be.
Indrani, do you see more that India is doing, for instance, with other powers, in sync with other powers, as part of this global appetite to come up with alternatives to the BRI? The Biden administration, of course, is championing Build Back Better. Japan, of course, has been doing as much, if not more, than China. And it's sometimes strange, given the amount of investment and support that Japan does, it doesn't get that kind of credit because perhaps it didn't come up with a fancy sounding slogan, but it is there everywhere. So what do you see India doing, especially in terms of new initiatives of linking up with other powers in doing things together in the neighborhood, when you have so many countries that are saying the same thing about wanting to offer credible alternatives to China?
Well, I think I would say that this idea of matching rupee with renminbi makes no sense at all. The second is, I think over the years, we have become better at delivery. I think the biggest problem with India's development initiatives was not the concept, or was not even the intent. It was the delivery. We were very poor at delivery. And I think we've sort of moved up on a scale of 0 to 10. We've moved from 4 to 6. But there's still a bit to be covered. I also believe that we should pick and choose our development initiatives, in the sense that, and wait, not everything the headline mustn't turn. And I just look at Sri Lanka. I mean, there is Sri Lanka today. I mean, the Rajapaksas have literally put the country on a platter to the Chinese, and you can see what they've created a mess in terms of something as simple as organic fertilizers. And you don't have to go that far to see how they can mess it all up, and how the Chinese can mess it all up. Not only supplying contaminated fertilizers, but also sanctioning banks. But look at something else. Look at the port. Look at the port that we all tore our hair about, and how the Chinese were taking over the port, and we got shut out of the Eastern Container Terminal. I would say, on balance, given the space of time, if you look at the terms of the Western Container Terminal that we are actually going to be building, I think that's actually is better terms for India. Also, we really ought to be looking at port terminals also in a strategic context, because it's not merely the fact that Colombo's 80% of Colombo's cargo comes to us, but it's how we leverage that. And I think right now we're leveraging it pretty decently in terms of at the Western Container Terminal, and the Sri Lankans. So it's not that the Chinese do things well, and I think Mr. Gokhale's point is perfectly taken, that it's whatever they announce is not what they deliver. So if we can get even our delivery right, even if you promise one, at least if you can put that on the ground, I think we will have a much better sense of where we should be.
Right. So if you have questions, please do raise your hand or enter into the chat box. I see a raised hand from Mr. Sumantran. Could you please raise your question if you can hear me?
First of all, I must say commendations to this panel. It is the kind of dignified, informed discussion that really makes CIC so proud to have people like this. So thank you.
We've lost you.
Mr. Sumantran, are you there?
Yeah, sorry. I think I was just... So, first of all, thank you very much. I have two questions. The first I would say is maybe this discussion points to the fact that democracies need to shed this appalling naivety when it comes to having to deal with China. I mean, US presidents seem to have, had this belief that they welcome China into the group of economic nations, bring them into a WTO, and we will bring them all into this very nice, comfortable existence as, a modus vivendi, so to say. So, and now US presidents are wondering whether they have been completely naive in this assumption. We were also basking so comfortably in the camaraderie in Mamallapuram with Xi and Modi. And we find that very soon after that, we've had very tragic events at Galwan. Even in trade, the Chinese have been so successful in seducing everybody from a General Motors to a Daimler to a Volkswagen to an Airbus to come in. And it seems that in all of these cases, as Ambassador Gokhale has said, China has played the long game, and they have chosen to upend status quo, whether it was on trade, whether it was on military, at their convenience. And it now looks in hindsight that we have all been collectively appallingly naive. So is this a time and a way for the country to manufacture opinion to shed this naivety? So this is my first question. I will give you the second one, and I will certainly look forward to it. The second is there a fallacy in thinking about two parallel strategies, one for military and one for trade? At the end of the day, isn't there a very, very strong coupling between the two? Coupling in two dimensions at least. Trade is an opportunity to portray your markets as muscle and accomplish some of the other strategic objectives you have that you may not be able to achieve with military means. So there is a coupling between trade and military there. The second coupling is the fact that China can say, we will produce a 5th generation stealth fighter, and we can produce any number of AI-equipped drones to monitor the line of actual control, and we can build 100 kilometers of road in God knows how many days because of the industrial might of the country augmenting their military strength, is again another coupling between trade and military. Therefore, how do we leverage this coupling in the way we deal with China, which I was seeing as a point that Dr. Shankar was trying to make? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Two great questions. I'd like all three of you to weigh in on it, starting with Dr. Shankar, please.
Let me begin by saying that there has to be a holistic approach covering all dimensions. And that's what I've been trying to say earlier on. And democracies are sometimes needlessly made to appear weak. Well, they're not necessarily weak. So I don't subscribe to the belief that because we are a democracy, we need to underperform, or that because the Chinese are authoritarian, they have done so well. And there are lots of things which we can and should do democratically, but that's a separate debate. But more than that, I think we need the national consensus that this is where we need to go. And we need to go in a certain direction, both for the strategic reasons vis-a-vis China, but also to create our own jobs and to survive and prosper and get rid of poverty and achieve our development goals. And there's no reason we should be dependent on Chinese API or Chinese solar panels. We can make all those things in India. So the bigger debate is how do we start doing it quickly enough in a vision and a strategy which is not looking at the next 2 years. There has to be a certain long-term approach and a long-term planning for that purpose.
Ambassador Gokhale, would you like to share your thoughts?
Sorry, sure. I wanted to address the point on democracies. Let me be clear about this. I don't believe there was such a great naivety in the West in believing that China would eventually become a democracy. Yes, it is true that in some quarters, particularly in the liberal thinking of the West, this might have been a view. But let us not forget that the West was making obscene amounts of money in China from 1990 to 2010. And ultimately, it was not the White House, but the Wall Street that was making China policy. It would be naive to believe that the American intelligence and information gathering system did not know about human rights violations in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in 1990, in 2000, or in 2010. If they did not choose to speak about it, it was because they didn't want any implications for the enormous sums of money they were making in China, that their companies were making in China. And it's only now, when the Chinese have restricted their economic space, that they are coming out with these issues. So while there may have been some naive thinking in the liberal wing of the Democratic Party, or maybe among some intellectuals in the West, this was not mainstream thinking even then. And certainly in India, my sense is that no leader and no government was so naive as to believe that China would become democratic. On the contrary, I can say with some degree of confidence, since I worked in the government and on China for nearly 30 years, that the Indian leadership from Indira Gandhi onwards, without exception, believed that a stronger China would become even more authoritarian and not democratic. My second point I did want to address was that despite this, we need to keep the conversation with China going. And that conversation occurs at various levels. It occurs at a functional level, it occurs at a ministerial level, and it occurs at the level of the summit as well. That is the chief executives of the two countries. I don't think that any relationship, however inimical it is, should allow for a break in that communication. Because when communication breaks, the outcome is war. Diplomacy is the gray zone before that communication, And if you stop talking, you start fighting. Therefore, I think we need to look at summit level meetings not from the context simply of outcomes, because summits rarely bring outcomes, but in the context of keeping that channel of communications open. Having said that, I think 2020 is very much a watershed in India-China relations. I think a reassessment is taking place quite clearly, even as we speak. And I have no doubt that this will impact in the long run in a holistic fashion, not just on the political side of the relationship, but also on the trade, cultural, people-to-people, etc. That having been said, I only hope that at the end of it all, communication does resume, because both of us are far too big and our economies are far too important for us to contemplate conflict of any kind.
Before posing that to Indrani, I should highlight Ambassador Gokhale's book. The Long Game was mentioned, but he's also written a book on Tiananmen where he does reflect on this question of, especially in the last chapter, of how the West dealt with the aftermath of 1989, which I highly recommend. And if I could just abuse my privilege, Ambassador Gokhale, and pose one question to you on the point of communication. Is it worrying that you've had this huge crisis in the relationship for 18 months, and despite the fact that you had so much engagement between Prime Minister Modi and President Xi and meetings at so many different levels, as far as we know, they haven't spoken throughout this entire period. Is that something that would worry you, the fact that there seems to be a breakdown at that highest level, or is it just a function of where the relationship is now?
I think it's a function of where the relationship is. I don't think we should be perturbed, because at the ministerial level, communications are taking place in the margins of meetings, and at the functional level, delegations are talking. If at all there is any concern, it is the fact that even though the Chinese have agreed to disengagement and de-escalation in December 2020 and in February 2021, they are going back on that promise. Now, in the circumstance where the Chinese are walking back rather than walking the talk, they're walking back from the talk. I believe that any higher level intervention doesn't appear to make sense. And I presume that the government is thinking in the same way that I am, in the sense that until that ground situation is resolved to mutual satisfaction, you can't move ahead with the rest of the relationship.
Indrani, would you like to weigh in on Sumantran's question on this whole idea of naivety and democracies vis-a-vis dealing with China?
Well, democracies are, just by the very fact that a democracy means that you are putting your faith not in a person, but in a system, and in a system of not just leadership, but in a system of governance, which is so different from the kind of system that the Chinese are in. Just that very fact means that you put your faith in an ideal. And if that is considered to be naive, I'm not one of those who believe that the democracies make people naive. Yes, there used to be a dominant Western narrative about China becoming more democratic once it became richer. And as if for anybody who has read Mr. Gokhale's book, it's very clear that the Indians who are also, I mean, we are the largest democracy after all, that the Indian system never actually sort of bought that line. So I don't believe that democracies necessarily make us more naive. Yes, decision making is probably more difficult, but decision making is at the end of the day, it would probably be more acceptable to a larger number of people. We don't know exactly what would happen if China lifted restrictions on its social media or on its censorship, etc. We don't know what would happen. We can see what we live in the middle of in our country. So I don't actually buy that. That the other point about companies, etc., doing the government bidding. Now the point is that Chinese companies or the Chinese industry are not exactly private sector. They are, I mean, they are very much an arm of the state. And for everybody who has seen what Tencent and Alibaba has been put through, or at least the big tech crackdown that we have seen in the last, you can see that the Chinese state has the ability and the space to make that, to do that kind of stuff on their companies, on their billionaire, unicorns. We don't have that, and that makes that difference between the private sector and the public sector is actually important for a democracy to function. And so I would not trade this for that. We just have to be better at what we are rather than wanting to be like them. I think that's pretty much it.
Very well put, Indrani. I will, there are two similar questions from V. Ranganathan and Kalyana Raman. I'll read them both out and ask all three of you to weigh in. V. Ranganathan says, do the panelists inherently recognize the relative imbalance, both materially and militarily, between the two countries, so that a solution in our interest isn't easy? A question on the imbalance. And I would just add to that, can it be said the imbalance is not narrowing but widening, and how do we deal with that? And then one question from Kalyana Raman, who says, this is a bit of a provocative one, which I don't think any of you might agree with, but with 5 times India's size and China's determined objectives, and again, on the balance of power appears in China's favor, should we even aspire and make feeble attempts to take them on, or should we just reconcile and focus on internal issues? So if I can start with Dr. Shankar, please.
I believe we can catch up and should try to catch up, and we should not be lacking in ambition. But I would also like to add that China is the preeminent power in this century. So certainly we have to live with them, deal with them, and hope that their way of understanding and dealing with the world changes. One other point which I think is important at this juncture is that for a variety of reasons, the West would like to support India's rise. So it is for us to be able to make the most of it at this juncture in terms of alternative supply chains, security of supplies, etc. And even to match the BRI type of effort by Western capital, long-term financing, their firms and our firms providing lower cost manpower, both at management level as well as working level, and being an effective competitor to whatever the Chinese can offer. I think it's easily doable. But that needs a different kind of ambition and a different kind of focus. That, okay, we will tie up with Siemens and some consortium will give the credit, we will do the second order work and build a high-speed train somewhere in the world or build something else. So that kind of ambition, I think we need, and we should try and start doing it without too much of a initial hype. We should feel our way, find something, do it, then go from strength to strength. And similarly, in becoming part of the global supply chain as a measure of risk mitigation vis-a-vis China, I think it's a golden opportunity for us, but we have to get our act together and act very fast.
Ambassador Gokhale, on the question of the imbalance between the two, and if I could just put it in a different way, do you see us narrowing it, or I think in your previous answer, you said you were cautiously optimistic in some of the things that we were doing. So how would you sort of see this balance of power between India and China going forward?
Yeah, Anand, there's no doubt that, and there's no gainsay, that at this stage they have a huge lead upon us. But going ahead with, when we look at future projections, even today, most of the world forgets one important variable. And that variable is the stability of the Chinese Communist Party. Ultimately, in a democracy, a government must go to the people every 4, 5, or 6 years and get a mandate. And on the basis of the mandate, it can execute policy. In the case of the Chinese Communist Party, it has never sought that mandate. And therefore, when it claims that it enjoys the support of the people, who knows? We have not factored in the possibility that the system is so brittle from within that if at some point of time the people decide not to have that party in power, the structure will crumble. That won't happen in India. If a political party loses office, you leave the government. The structure does not crumble. That's the first point. The second point is, counterintuitively, Xi Jinping's tightening hold on power suggests to me a certain sense of nervousness, not confidence. When we go into a bank, why do we clutch onto the briefcase or the purse? Because there's money in it. The fear of losing it makes us grip something tighter than when we have nothing to lose. And we must remember here, this is just counterintuitive, but we have to remember that the last such instance when a leader tightened his grip, that was Mao Zedong in 1966, brought the system down. He did it to eliminate his opponents, but ultimately he lost control of it. And when he lost control of it, there was the Cultural Revolution and then the virtual collapse of China until Deng Xiaoping came along and restored order. Therefore, we should not presume that his tightening the grip is necessarily only going to have a positive outcome. I believe that today, if anything has to be watched, it is not China's external actions, but China's internal developments. And the more they project a sense of confidence and unity, the more I am convinced that there are problems within that system.
No, it's a fascinating answer and a memorable line that I'll remember, Ambassador Gokhale. The final word to you, Indrani, in terms of the balance between India and China and where you see this going.
Well, yes, I mean, they are 5 times our size. That doesn't mean we don't have elements of, comprehensive national power. And the elements of comprehensive national power with India are actually increasing. And we can see that. That is our benchmark is, where do you see the Chinese? That you see the Chinese in terms of their GDP. But as Ambassador Gokhale said very, very clearly, and I completely agree, there is that brittleness you cannot judge from the outside. What you can judge is that in India you have your issues, you have your politics, but you have those elections, and today, tomorrow, day after, somebody will go, somebody will come, and you know that, and the system doesn't fall. But he's absolutely right. So it's not that, I mean, I think we've measured our metrics of national power with the metrics of national power for a system that is completely different from ours. And I don't think we need to do that. So yes, they're GDP wise, they are much bigger, but we are holding man for man on the border. I mean, I don't think the Chinese will win any war that they want to impose on India. They might win the occasional battle. They never win the war. And they know that. That's exactly why we should just, I keep saying that we just have to be better versions of ourselves.
A great way to end this conversation and this discussion today. Thank you so much, Indrani, Ambassador Gokhale, Dr. Shankar. I think it's impossible for me to try and sum up. It's been so wide-ranging. the takeaways that stay with me is the fact that we have to look at this relationship holistically, not just security, not just trade. And I think a lot of hard sort of questions for India to deal with in terms of looking at this more long-term rather than looking at immediate policy. And I think the big question of China's internal dynamics as well, which I think is a very, very important point that both Ambassador Gokhale and Indrani brought up at the very end. I think we do well to keep that in mind. Thank you all so much for this great conversation, and I will hand over to Vanita for a final word.
Before that, Anand Krishna, I just have one question, if you permit me. Just one final question from my side. We are focused on reducing the trade deficit between India and China. Particularly, Commerce Ministry wants to bring the trade deficit down, which is understandable. But having hit the $100 billion number, should we be focusing more on the top line rather than the trade deficit, or both are important?
Maybe a quick response from Dr. Shankar.
I think the answer has to be seen from two perspectives. One is that we need to lower both and convey that we will lower it in a very sustained manner if we do not see a change in behavior. And we'll be prepared to pay the price for it. That's the messaging we need to get across. And we can do so credibly only if we decide to do it and really start implementing. The other is that assuming that there is a change in the relationship and it becomes positive, then we have to see it in a purely pragmatic manner as to what is it that aids our growth, what is it that aids our job creation, and how do we get the most out of an economic relationship. But that situation and that question and that perspective, in my view, becomes relevant only when there is good conduct and our message has gone through. And that we should convey that you may be 5 times our size GDP, but we can pay a higher price and manage without your trade and commercial relationship.
Thank you, Dr. Shankar, and over to you, Vanita.
Thank you, Anand, for putting this program together for us. Such an intellectual discussion. Thank you. Very, very important in the current scheme of things. Thanks, Indrani. Thanks, Ajay, and thanks, Mr. Vijay Gokhale, and thanks to all our audience who have attended the program today. And we hope to be back with another interesting discussion very soon. Thank you, and good evening, everyone.
Thank you.